times were different back then. This was in 2008. So things didn't travel and the news didn't travel as fast and didn't have the true crime communities and podcasts that we have now. So it was a little different time, but I was still in Boston. It was 2008. I was not in the behavioral analysis unit yet. And I saw this headline of these two girls, ages 13 and 11, who on a beautiful Sunday afternoon, were walking down a rural dirt road in Walika, Oklahoma, and they were shot and killed, shot multiple times with multiple guns. And I really just thought to myself, who could do something like that? And I related to them because, I had grown up in a small town. We lived on a dirt road in Oregon. And I thought, like, how many times did I walk that road or went for a run on that road? So I just sort of thought, wow, this is just really, I could relate.
This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jayson Blair. That's Julia Cowley, a retired FBI agent and criminal profiler. This is the second of 2 episodes with Julia. If you haven't had the chance to go back and listen to the first one, I recommend you check it out. In that episode, we discussed how a love for true crime led Julia to become a criminal profiler, how one rises to that position in the FBI's elite behavioral analysis unit, her work on the Golden State Killer and Israel Keys cases, and the emotional toll of immersing yourself in violent crimes every workday. Today, we're going to talk more about that emotional impact, her work on high-profile serial and terrorism cases, understanding the minds of those who haunt so many of us, and specific cases in the news, like the 1996 death of JonBenét Ramsey, the murders of Abigail Williams and Libby in Delphi, Indiana, and the 2022 University of Idaho Murders. Julia spent 22 years in the FBI investigating violent crime, including years on the famed BAU, or Behavioral Analysis Unit. Julia makes no bones about the fact that true crime is what led her toward forensic science and law enforcement. Prior to joining the FBI, Julia was a special agent and forensic scientist with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. She has a bachelor's degree in chemistry from the University of Oregon and a master's degree in forensic science from George Washington University. Julia is also the host of her own podcast, The Consult, a true crime podcast that's currently on hiatus, but I'd still recommend you check it out. It's great. It's interesting you mentioned that. I remember a friend who once asked me, what do you think makes serial killers? And I said, the same things that make you and me. And they're mysterious and they're hard to figure out. Maybe there are patterns between them or certain personality characteristics. But I was saying to him, it's mysterious what makes one person go one way and one person go the same way, often with the very, very similar life experiences. I was going to ask you about something. I remember listening to the Golden State Killer podcast that you did, and also listening to some of the other ones. And probably the one that affected me the most was listening to the story, even more than Golden State with all of his victims, or even more than Israel Keys, was the story, murders of 11-year-old, and I had never heard of them, 11-year-old Skyla Whitaker and 13-year-old Taylor, is it Placker?
Yeah, it's Skyla Whitaker and Taylor Placker. Yeah.
Okay.
And they were,
yeah, Patrick. Okay. They were best friends, right? Who were murdered while walking.
Yes.
Just walking down a dirt road in Oklahoma. And
yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about that case and those kinds of cases that never make the headlines that have been a part of your career?
Sure. And that one did make the headline. I had, but maybe not as widespread definitely not as widespread as Delphi, but as the case in Delphi, Indiana. But times were different back then. This was in 2008. So things didn't travel and the news didn't travel as fast and didn't have the true crime communities and podcasts that we have now. So it was a little different time, but I was still in Boston. It was 2008. I was not in the behavioral analysis unit yet. And I saw this headline of these two girls, ages 13 and 11, who on a beautiful Sunday afternoon, were walking down a rural dirt road in Walika, Oklahoma, and they were shot and killed, shot multiple times with multiple guns. And I really just thought to myself, who could do something like that? And I related to them because, I had grown up in a small town. We lived on a dirt road in Oregon. And I thought, like, how many times did I walk that road or went for a run on that road? So I just sort of thought, wow, this is just really, I can relate.
You saw yourself in their shoes.
Yeah. And I just became interested in the case, and I would follow it on the news and Google it every now and then to see, has there been any progress? And one day I Googled it, and by this point, it was maybe 3 years later, and I was in the behavioral analysis unit, and I saw that that the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation was going to be asking for assistance from the FBI, and some of that assistance was going to be a request from the behavioral analysis unit. And at the time, I was still in training, and part of our training was to work different cases in different units. And so this was...
I see a coach put me in coming any minute.
Yeah, absolutely. I talked to my boss and I said, do you think if I go down and ask if I can work on this case that they'll let me do it for my training? And he said, yeah, why don't you go ask? So I went and asked the other supervisor of the Crimes Against Children unit if I could work on that case. Could it be, and I want to say work on it, I would be the lead profiler, and it would be a case that I would work on with other people to get my certification. And so they said, sure, you can have it. And I think, just kind of technically what I liked about the case is it wasn't sexual exploitation, at least, from what I knew of it. And it turned out that it wasn't, but it was also more of a traditional homicide and had more of a traditional crime scene than the majority of their crimes against children cases. So I thought this is a good one for me. And because I had a really strong background in crime scene reconstruction and all of that. So there was a lot of good behavior at the crime scene. So I thought this would be a really good case. And plus I just was very interested in the case. And it was a little surreal to have, like, 3 years earlier thought, boy, what kind of person would do such a thing? And then be the person that was going to determine exactly that. And so that's how I got involved in it.
Wouldn't the first normal suspects be like family members or somebody?
Yes. Yes. And there was a lot of speculation in the media. And even speculation amongst witnesses who were interviewed that, oh, well, her family were into drugs and this was a killing, revenge for, drug debts or something. There was a lot of speculation or they came across, I think somebody had speculated at one point that they must have seen something or come across a meth lab. And I asked the investigators, well, is there a meth lab around here? He's like, well, probably the closest one is maybe 3 miles away. And I'm like, okay, that's not the motive.
And something really weird is happening if you're like killing 2 kids over a meth lab.
Yeah. There was, and certainly you have to look at family first. And that was one of the main things that I did was look at their victimology. And I wanted to know everything. And that was not as thorough as I was wanting it to be. They did a pretty good job, but I'm like, okay, I want you to give we have questionnaires, and I wanted them to give questionnaires to different people that knew them, like in school and their friends and family. And I really want to know, what did they have access to? And so they gave out these questionnaires and I was able to review them. And the victimology was extremely helpful. And I felt like, okay, there is just nothing in their victimology that would suggest that they would be at risk for this kind of killing. They were.
So it helps you exclude a lot of things.
It did. And but again, that's not an absolute. So that is not like, okay, there's there wasn't something, or there was a motive that I wouldn't recognize as a motive. And, people, so there always could be something, but, just from what I could tell, and it was a very thorough investigation by the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. And so that I thought of a lot of information to draw from. They were not at risk. They were not at risk. So what happened? I thought, okay, whatever happened, the motive was formed on the road that day. Something happened. And what could happen between, and until afterwards, I never really kind of figured out what was that interaction that caused someone to shoot two little girls multiple times with multiple weapons. And so that was one of the things. The other thing was that there was a lot of disagreement. Was it one shooter or two shooters? You had two guns. So I had to piece back together through the really good crime scene documentation and the autopsy report. And that there was it was all very thorough, well documented. So that was really helpful to me. And I was kind of able to piece back together who was shot first, who was what, the sequence of events, basically.
So you're sort of looking at the victim, looking at what criminal act happened, looking at the statistics you talked about, looking at the crime scene. And it's almost like it's painting a picture for you with the missing piece, and the missing piece is the offender. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And
what sort of fits into this piece? What's missing from this?
Right. And you have to also look at, and this seems so simplistic, but you have to look at, what do we know about this offender? And in terms of the sequence of events, and this goes to what we talked about earlier about statistics, and you just mentioned it again. So when you have multiple victims, statistically, they're probably killed by one offender. That's just statistics.
Well, and also logic in the sense that, like, the best way to keep a secret is by killing the other person. So if somebody else wasn't recently killed, the likelihood that two people are going to be able to hold Delphi aside, hold a secret about killing two kids, that seems kind of low to me.
Right. And that is hard. Like, if you have two people, it is harder to keep that secret. So that's a factor you take. Okay, nobody's ever told anybody, or there's just nothing credible anyway. But then I was just looking at the actual, when I pieced back together kind of the crime scene dynamics, and this was the strength that I brought to BAU, is I could, I had this background. And, and we had such thorough documentation from the crime scene team that processed the scene and documented all the autopsy and all of that. And what I concluded is that there's just nothing there that one person couldn't have done. There wasn't like, simultaneously this victim shot with all these, with this gun, and this victim shot with all. And so that really just like, okay, there's one offender. And that was a question I thought needed to be answered, because there were many investigators that really thought it was two offenders. And then, was the person local or not local? And because there was, we saw this stranger on the road. And this was a very rural area. It was out, like, all the roads were dirt roads. It was, you get so lost out there. Like, it was, and they all look the same. And unless you're from there, know that area, it would really be hard to just wander in there off the interstate, and kill these two little girls and just get out of there and not be seen. And
were they discovered relatively quickly?
They were.
So it would have been easy to wander in, but hard to get out.
I think so. I think you had to know the area. That was my, and this was one of the crime scenes that really, it really helped to visit it, because I rode out there with the investigators, and I'm like, I'm totally lost. And the roads were not, at the time, they were numbered. They didn't have names. So even that made it more confusing. I mean, it's much easier to remember the name of a road than, a number like, 667 or,
Right.
It's like, the numbers just get jumbled. And so that was another question. Was it local? Was it one offender, two offender? What was the motive? But the other thing, like going back to, okay, what did we know about him? And this is something that I keyed in on. And I said, okay, what we know, or what I believe I know or think is that this motive was formed on the road that day. This is not as a result of some like long-standing retribution that somebody had. There was no indication in the family that they were at risk from anyone, or that the family was involved in really any high-risk behavior that would result in something like this. Everybody's got their things, but there was just, again, nothing in this family. It was like, okay, this is what led to this. And so the motive was formed that day. So what we know is that somebody was driving down the road that day, had an interaction with these girls, and just happened to have two guns with them. That's what we know. They had at least two guns in their car that day, and they used them, and they used them well, and they used them without hesitation. And so I remember giving the profile to the investigators, and it was a whole table, and even the command staff was there. And I said, okay, this is a gun nut.
Right.
They all started laughing, and, oh, you're in Oklahoma. And I said, no, it's like, I grew up in a town where there's a lot of hunters, and they had their guns in the gun racks of their trucks. I said, it's not this. Yeah, I know everybody around here has guns. This is somebody who, had a 22 and potentially a Glock 40. They carry it. They carry it in their car with them. Likely people who know this person will know they have their gun. They probably brag about how good they are at shooting their gun. They probably have practiced. This is somebody that I believe is just a little bit more over the top with guns than your average person who is into sport or something, or just for protection. And so I tried to paint that picture for them. It's like, it's not just somebody with guns, because, again, everybody there had guns, and not too long after that, it was a couple months later, and I got a call from one of the investigators, and he said, hey, we've just arrested a guy who killed his fiance, and he fits the profile. I think he did. I think he killed Skyla and Taylor. And I was just like, okay, I really like how you're thinking. I'm glad you really took the profile. But here's where I caution people. You just, a profile is not the be all end all. And I thought, okay, maybe you're overthinking. Maybe he's like, no, he kept saying he fits the profile. He fits it, But I thought, I'm also like, a lot of people can fit profiles. That's the thing. So I was doubting myself. I'm like, what have I done? And I was doubting myself for sure. And he said no. And then he sent me pictures of the offender that the offender had taken. And they were these glamour shots of him, these sort of, I guess he considered them artistic, where he's posing with his weapons. And I just went, that's what I meant. Yeah. That's what I meant by, he likes guns. And he was known to have had a Glock 40. And then as the investigation, as they really started to investigate him for these murders, they were able to find shell casings from the crime scene that matched shell casings on his grandfather's property, and his grandfather's property wasn't too far away from the crime scene, and he would do target practice there. So there was forensic evidence to link him to the homicides. And then following that, they provided all the information they could about this offender. And then we gave them an interview strategy to interview him. And he did confess. The confession wasn't perfect. He tried to say that he killed monsters and he was seeing things and stuff like that.
Right.
But
so that's a really great example, right, of how you guys are able to support, by building the profile, really support the investigative work, but then also, it sounds like, jump in relatively quickly and give them interview strategies for it.
Yeah, and that's the part where I get stressed. Like I'm sort of slow. And I like to have all the time in the world to pore over things and be very meticulous and and that's what you should do, when you are doing a profile, so to speak. You really should take that time. And so when I'm rushed, I get out of my comfort zone. So this was kind of like, we need an interview strategy. And so, I really worked on it. I pulled someone in that I had a lot of respect for in my unit, who was very good with interview strategies. And we came up with an interview strategy, and it did work. But you know what? We didn't do it. The investigator, he had to do it. And it's really easy to kind of sit back and say, this is what you need to do. But when you're under pressure and everybody's watching you, and this is the biggest case that your state has seen in 25 years, it's a lot of pressure for someone to just, go in and do an interview and get a confession. And that's not what I did. That's what he did. And but ultimately, the confession and some forensic evidence, and so as you can see, that is a perfect example, like you said, of supporting the investigation, but it did not solve the investigation.
Right.
It assisted it like other pieces, but in my opinion, forensic evidence is always, the best. It's great to have a confession that actually matches the crime scene as well. That helps. But that was one of my, and I'm say it was one of my favorite cases. But every time I was working on a case, there was always something about it that was important to me. It didn't have to be a big, high profile case. It's just the actual work itself and solving a puzzle in a way. But,
Right.
but as you can see, like just these simple questions, like, okay, what do we know? Well, he had 2 guns and he had a Glock and he carries it in his car. Ask people, do you know anyone who just carries Glocks around in their car and a 22, multiple guns in their cars? Things like that. It's just, it's kind of basic.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense to me. So, it wouldn't be a podcast with a criminal profiler if I didn't ask you about some current cases. And I'm not going to ask you as a profiler. I'm going to ask you as a true crime fan who happens to have formerly been a profiler. And first, before I say this, like the perspective that I come from every time I get interested in one of these cases is it's not voyeuristic for me, anything like that. What causes me to gravitate toward cases is I sort of start with the baseline that human life is precious. And I think my interest in the cases really come from who would intentionally take a human life. So I'm going to run through a couple and just give me your quick spin, just like your, 1 or 2 sentence spin on what type of person might have committed some of these crimes. And, and I say this because I think it's a great opportunity to show what profiling or perspective can really do, particularly also when you don't have the case file. Because I think of a lot of the people who go on TV and describe themselves as profilers, they're not exactly covering themselves in glory. Like, hey, JonBenét's brother did it, or, the Idaho murder suspect is brilliant, or he's a moron, or the Delphi guy must be a serial killer. I think some of that stuff that is relatively simple. But I wanted to ask you about a couple cases, if you're okay with that.
Okay. And I always caveat that you cannot profile anything without all the information, because within the case files and within the photographs and within the details, it's always, you just can't do it. So, but I'm happy to do the best that I can. And like, sometimes
Okay. Okay. All right.
Watching Dateline with my husband, he'll be like, what do you think? And I'll be like, I don't know. And he's, what good are you?
She's like, how would I know? I know nothing.
I'm really not fun, because a lot of people will ask, well, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? And I'm like, I really don't know. I don't like, and I think they think she doesn't know what she's talking about.
Well, yeah.
She's like, God.
Do your best, but
I'll do my best.
do the part where you say, I don't know.
Okay. I would say, I don't know everything.
So I was going to ask about somewhat obscure one. I was going to start out with. That's one that I've followed for years and years. And you tell me if you haven't heard of it, we can pass it. But have you heard of the Lewis and Clark Valley killers, the Snake River killer case? That's the
No.
one. You haven't heard of that one?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so let me go make my plug for everyone to go figure this one out. So back in 1979, a 12-year-old girl named Christina Lee White was abducted in Anniston, Washington, which is right near the Idaho border. And then, her mom didn't pick her up. I think she was out on a bike and the license plate to the bike disappeared, but the bike may have been found. Then, years later, in 1981, a woman named Kristen David, who was a 22-year-old University of Idaho student, was last seen riding her bicycle from Moscow, actually, Idaho, familiar in the news now, down to Clarkston, Washington, which was right near where Christina White disappeared. And she disappeared. Eventually, her bones were discovered in the Snake River. And then, in 1982, three kids, 18-year-old girl, 21-year-old girl, and a 35-year-old man just were missing in Lewiston, Idaho's Civic Theater, right near all of these places. They had gone there late at night separately, the two girls together and the one guy, and they disappeared and are all believed to be murdered. And what brought the cases together was that a guy who worked at the theater and was an actor at the theater also had lived in the house of Christina White at the time. So in this particular case, and I'm not going to ask you about it because this is just my pitch for everybody to figure it out, they had identified this one suspect that they had interviewed and who had denied it, but it ends up being, when they look back, he grew up in Chicago and a young girl was killed at the YMCA he worked right after having an interaction with him. Then he had gone out to California after that and had been arrested trying to break into a mortuary where another girl who is dead, who supposedly committed suicide, where her body was. And he had said he just wanted to visit his girlfriend. I don't know about you. I covered unnatural death, and I don't think I've had that many people die beside me. So this is just my pitch for the Snake River Killer folks to solve that case. So I'll ask you about a couple others because I'm not going to.
And that could be a case like before my time that somebody at BAU looked at, or maybe looked at one or two of these incidents. Yep. It's possible, but it's not one I'm familiar with, and I didn't work on it or know anyone who did, but it could have been before my time.
Well, as a true crime fan and somebody who is interested in these things, there's a very active community trying to solve the case that you can find online. There's a great podcast called The Snake River Killer. They also have, I think it's Lewis Clark Valley Facebook page that's really, really fascinating. It's a private Facebook page with people who all have skills related to this. So can I make my pitch that you join that Facebook page?
Well, I probably won't because I'm not on Facebook. But I will definitely look and read about the case. I do get very interested, like other people that are interested in true crime, of doing kind of a deep dive. And then I have my group of people, like one of my best friends that I discuss cases with. She's a polygrapher in the FBI. So I mean, I bounce ideas and we talk about these cases that we have no involvement in, but we just find very interesting. So absolutely. Thank you for.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I will. I'm happy to have you on the team on that one. So let me throw out one that everyone's going to know: the killing of JonBenét. It's been theorized that his brother did it, out of rage, or his mother did it out of rage, or all sorts of other people. It's always struck me about that case that it doesn't really seem to me to be something that a family member would do out of rage. So go ahead. Give me your thoughts on JonBenét Ramsey.
Okay. Well, there are two theories, two prevailing theories. It's a family member or an intruder. And both sides are very passionate about their beliefs and their opinions. And I have an opinion, and I'm not passionate about it because I don't really ever get too passionate. I just realize, okay, this is what I think, and other people are probably going to disagree, and they have valid reasons for disagreeing. But
occupational hazard there.
You just can never get too tied down to what you think, because there's always something else that may prove you wrong. And I'm a big believer in that. But the way that I see it is that I do believe that it was an intruder. The reason why I think that is because I do not believe, and I think we can all agree that everyone does agree that the offender wrote the ransom note. And that is the most discussed ransom note in the history of the world.
Mm-hmm.
But I
always thought about that was, if I broke into your house, I bet I could find out enough about you to write a crazy ransom note. But the part that struck me about that is he's like quoting movies. And that didn't really strike me as like a mom kind of thing.
Right. And unless somebody was to tell me that Patricia Ramsey, the mother, was an avid movie watcher, she knew all these quotes and she memorized them and was ready to go after following. And the theory is that either the son, JonBenét's brother, who was 9 years old at the time, or Patricia Ramsey, the mother, hit her at some point, and then they covered it up by staging a sexual homicide, and then covered that up by staging a fake kidnapping. So see, as you see where I'm going with this, it just becomes less plausible to me. And I think, so, in terms of the note itself, and I have kind of two ways I look at it. Let's just look at the note. Nothing written in that note you can attribute to Patricia Ramsey's personality because they're quotes from movies.
Right.
And it's all lies too. And so when you say, oh, somebody was very motherly because they said the person needed to be arrested, well, that's from a movie. So you can't really attribute a maternal instinct or feminine quality to the writer of the note, when that's really it's not the writer's words. That's a quote from a movie. And so that's kind of how I don't think you can take that and then like try to overlay a statement analysis of that note onto Patsy Ramsey. But what do we know? We know the person is an avid movie watcher, and they memorize these, and they didn't have access to the internet to come up with these quotes. They knew these quotes off the top of their head.
It was back in 1996, right? So
right.
Yeah.
So that's where you're going with that. And was Patricia an avid movie watcher? I don't know. I don't think that I've ever read, and I've read a lot about the case. We have talked about it amongst ourselves in the behavioral analysis unit when I worked there. And I've read all of the theories for and against. I always try to make sure that I understand both sides, and I'm going through those theories and trying to determine, why do I think that, or why don't I think that? And I try to have an open mind. And I've never seen anything that says Patsy Ramsey knew about these movies and was an avid movie watcher. I mean, she certainly was a busy, she raising two children, and she was very involved in her household and maintaining the mansion and showing her house and these pageants. So her kids were very important. Her home was very important. All of things. That's what I take from that. I never heard she sat down and watched all these movies. So I can't attribute that note to Patsy Ramsey in terms of behavior. So that's just a very brief analysis of what I think about the note. Well, I'll actually go in a little bit more detail. So I do believe the note, and this is where I think potentially things went wrong. The note, I do believe, is staging. And oftentimes when someone is staging a scene, is because you're trying to make it look like something that it's not. And often that means that it's someone that's close to the victim, but not always. And so I think the interpretation of the staging was maybe missed or wrong at the time. And people's like, okay, this is staging. It has to be someone in the family. It has to be someone close. I saw it as staging as someone who's trying to cover up a sexual homicide or delay the finding of a body or a number of things. So
that they didn't come in for a kidnapping. They came in for a sexual homicide.
I believe that's what the note is trying to divert attention from. I read it's like, hey, look, I'm this big bad kidnapper, and it's like it's all over the place in terms of quotes, and it's taking from different movies, and so the kidnapper really doesn't know who he wants to be, but other than I want to be viewed as a cool character, a cool kidnapper that I've seen in these movies, and that way you don't know that what I really am is a sexual predator of children. And
right.
And so I think it was staging in terms of that that's my opinion. And I know people will disagree, and that's fine. And I can't say that I'm right. That's just how I interpret it. So that is my thought on JonBenét. I do believe that there is forensic evidence, and I'm not going to go into all of it, but that suggests that there was an intruder in the house, someone who was not in the family. And anytime you're taking evidence and you have to try to explain away the most logical conclusion, I think you're getting a little bit. Usually things are what they appear to be. And when you have to start saying, well, this was contaminated by this, or this is, it doesn't mean that it wasn't contaminated, but you're starting to kind of make excuses, or you're trying to invent scenarios of, why would this seemingly normal family, happy family, kill their daughter and stage it to look like a horrible sexual homicide? Why would they do that? Well, because she's really crazy. Well, where's the evidence she was crazy? Where is that? So when you have to invent these stories to make it fit your theory, I feel you're
look out.
Yeah, I feel that's where you start to have a problem. And I'm not saying that could happen. You really just don't know, but that's not what I believe. I believe let's just look at what we know about them, what the evidence is, and what we know for a fact is that the offender wrote that note. And what do we know about the words on that paper?
Yep.
So
that makes complete sense. So another one that people have been following is the Delphi murder, where the suspect approached the two girls, Libby German and Abby Williams, on a bridge. And it's well known, I think at one point it was called the Snapchat murders, because Libby had recorded someone approaching her, and later the police revealed a quote down the hill. And I know a lot came out of that. They were both murdered, and we don't exactly know the cause of death or exactly where the crime scene is. But one of the things I've heard over and over again, including some of our so-called profilers, is that the suspect must be a serial killer, or that multiple offenders were involved. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
I do have thoughts on that. And I'm going to caveat, I did not work on this case. I don't know all the details, but I have seen cases where you have a brutal homicide or something that just, you've killed two people. And so this person must have offended before. And I've seen multiple times where that is not necessarily the case. He doesn't have to be a serial killer. And so I don't think you can say that with any kind of certainty. Now, is it possible after killing these two victims, he would go on to kill more? Possibly. He might potentially be a serial killer or have thoughts and fantasies that he would act upon that would make him become a serial killer. But I don't think somebody who does that would necessarily have to be a serial killer. I worked on a case, it was 1992 homicide, and it was a brutal rape and murder of a young woman. She was kidnapped out of the store, and DNA never, and there was lots of DNA, and it never matched anyone. Everyone kept saying, well, he has to have done it before. He had to have done it again, and he never did. And there's never been any evidence to suggest that he's done it again. And I have seen multiple cases like that, whether it was a case that I worked on, a colleague that I worked on, or something that I have seen on a TV show or a documentary, where people do these horrible crimes that are sexually motivated, and they're brutal, and you think they had to have done it again. And that is just not always the case.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that genetic genealogy is telling us, so that many more of these are one-offs than we thought. What about the idea of two people committing that crime or being involved in that crime, like a groomer and the killer? And do you have any thoughts on that? You may have none.
Yeah, I mean, I again be careful with what I say, but statistically, it's probably one offender. And if there is crime scene evidence or subsequent investigation that shows that there's two offenders, then it's two offenders. But at this point, I would say statistically, probably just one offender. And and just because you have two victims, I mean, they are young. And so I would think, okay, you have to have someone who had a method to control them and to keep one from running. In the Whitaker case, in the Whitaker case, I will tell you, is different from Delphi, even though you have kind of similar circumstances. Two girls out for a walk and they're both murdered. It's a different case. So, but that offender lost control of one of the victims briefly. And you could tell that based on the crime scene and the photos and everything. So that told me too, like, two offenders would have had better control. So I would think that at the crime scene, and the processing of the crime scene, there might be evidence. If you only had one offender, that there could be evidence to suggest, okay, he wasn't able to control them perfectly. And if two offenders would be able to control two victims better, but it's not, in my mind, it's just statistically probably one offender who controlled them. And again, probably, the means to control, using a weapon of some sort, using his words, a person who appeared to them to be in some sort of authority figure. Maybe they had a reason to trust them. This is all speculation, but but there's multiple ways that one person can control two people. There's just multiple ways. And so it doesn't necessarily mean because there's two victims that there's two offenders. But again, if there's evidence developed, then it's two offenders. So.
Right that way, right? Okay, so here's my final one. So I'm a part of this Reddit group. Yes, I admit it.
Okay.
And it's a very small Reddit group. It's very funny. I actually unsubscribed from it yesterday. But people on it are adamant that there's no way in the University of Idaho killings, where 4 college students were killed in 2022, that all 4 could have been stabbed to death by one person in like a 15-minute window. And I often think to myself, you would be surprised what people can do. What are your thoughts on that case?
Well, whenever you say, okay, there's no way a person can do this, there is a way, and it is possible. And again, processing of that scene is going to be key, and trying to reconstruct what happened. It's not always easy, and you may not have evidence that gives you those answers or those definite answers. But I think that if there are multiple offenders, that they hopefully would be able to see that based on the dynamics of the crime scene and the interaction between the offenders and the victims. But just to say that there's no way one person can do that, that is not true. There is a way. It's happened. I mean, we've had, case upon case where one person has killed several people and even gone into homes and killed them with knives. But just, we've had mass murders. And so it is absolutely possible. It could just be one offender, but
right. Right.
It's just tough. You cannot base, I can't The only thing I'll ever say is like, yeah, it could be this, could be that.
I think we
And
make a lot of assumptions without facts, because I think of that Idaho case, like hoodie guy did it, this person did it, this person is there,
it's
or
terrible.
even
Yeah.
the Delphi case, because one person was grooming possibly one of the girls, that he must have been involved. And I think sometimes it's like easier. There's a part of us that doesn't want to believe that one guy could come into our house in the middle of the night and kill a bunch of people. And there's a part of us that wants to believe that there can't be, like in Delphi, that many sexual predators out there. And I think sometimes it's our own rationalizations and our own need to see the world in a certain way that drives us to believe certain things. Anyway, that was fascinating. So thank you very much.
I mean, Ted Bundy did it. I mean, it's like,
right.
There is precedence for one offender killing multiple people in that way in the middle of the night. And that has happened. And there are cases that a lot of these people that follow cases like the Idaho murders will recognize. So they should say, oh yeah, he did do it. So it is possible. But, that will remain to be seen. It's really difficult to weigh in on current cases with any authority when you don't have all the information that you need.
Can I pass that advice on to the other profilers, quote unquote?
Well, I mean, some people have, I just need to, I need to see everything. I just don't think you can weigh in. And I think you just have to say that. I don't know. It could be this, it could be that. There's a possibility. And you can draw from your own experience, your own background, your own education, things that you've seen and say, no, I have seen that before. And it could be this, but I've also seen that, it could be this. The strangest things happen. Sometimes you think, oh, this is how this played out. And you find out it's completely wrong. And that's all you have to remember from profiling is that there's just a lot of different possibilities, even when you do have all the information.
Right. That makes perfect sense. I wanted to give you a chance before we wrap up to share anything you want to share. Any message you want to send to local law enforcement or the public about profilers and sort of their role. Because listening to you as I listen to you, what I realize is like you play an important role in justice in more than one way, right? Like we talked about the idea that you can exclude certain people. Like that can stop, or at least help exclude certain people. That can stop wrongful convictions and even false confessions, which I'm still baffled mildly about, but I do kind of get them. But on the other hand, it can help bring justice by helping law enforcement find the right person. So I was just wondering if there's any closing message you wanted to throw out there.
Well, I think you said it perfect. You said it for me. I don't feel that the work I did or do as a profiler ever, I don't want to say brought justice. I never felt that was really my role. And I just felt my role was to, help people have a better understanding of that crime, which would include the motivation of the offender and how the victim was selected and the crime scene dynamics, and focus the investigation on the most probable offender, helping them prioritize people. So taking, taking what we know happened at the crime scene and what this tells us about the offender and overlaying that on potential suspects. And if it doesn't really fit, maybe they're a little bit lower on the list. And, this seems like a good match. You prioritize them. And that's how I say it. You are prioritizing this person as a suspect until you can rule them out. I would never say that person did it, ever, until they're convicted.
Right.
Personally, I might say, oh, yeah.
I'm sure he did it. But
that's your guy. But, just helping to prioritize and say, I'm not sure this person did it because they don't have these characteristics, or I don't think these two crimes are linked because this one, showed more sadism in their crime. And this one, they didn't have a lot of gratuitous violence. So these are probably two different offenders, just sort of helping them to again, just prioritize. And I think that's the best word to use, as opposed to saying, okay, this person did it. And then, just help with the strategies that can help them solve the case. And am I contributing to justice? I guess I hope so, but I never really looked at it like, oh, I'm out there getting justice. I feel that I was helping people to get justice.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, despite what you said, I do not find you boring, and I do not think my listeners will find you boring. I feel like this was a really fascinating, nuanced topic that can be helpful for people in understanding both what profilers do, and even for people in law enforcement who might lean into you for assistance or other folks like that. So let me thank you again for joining. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed talking with you. And it was a different perspective than what I'm used to talking about. So it was a lot of fun for me.
Oh, great.
And awesome. I wish you the best of luck with your podcast.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So far, having fascinating guests like you are making a big difference. So.
Well, excellent. I hope I don't hurt you.
No, I don't think so. Thanks, Julia. This is the end of our second episode with Julia Cowley. If you haven't had a chance to check out the first episode, I encourage you to go back and check that out. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jayson Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook Podcast.